Status check. Pacific Theater. Coordinates classified. 0300 hours. Sea State 4 with swells breaching 15 feet against the steel hull. A 19-year-old aviation boatswain's mate stands on the pitching flight deck, fighting physics, gravity, and exhaustion in the pitch black. He is not a pilot, but a yellow-shirted director, wielding the absolute authority of life and death over a $70 million asset. The aircraft is a Boeing F/A-18E Super Hornet, engines idling with a distinct, bone-rattling vibration that physically resonates in the chest cavity. The pilot, a lieutenant commander strapped into the ejection seat, is entirely blind to the deck edge, trusting the teenager's illuminated wands. One misinterpreted signal sends the 30-ton fighter skidding off the wet non-skid surface and into the crushing abyss of the dark ocean. If the catch wire snaps, the cable whips across the deck with enough kinetic energy to slice a human body in half instantly. Below deck, 5,000 souls sleep in shifts, their lives dependent on the relentless choreography occurring on the roof of their floating city. This high-stakes ballet happens every single night, a terrifying display of industrial might that relies on high school graduates to function. Currently, the United States Navy operates exactly 11 of these nuclear-powered leviathans, a number dictated by brutal, unforgiving mathematics. The number is not 10, nor 12, but 11. A rigid integer that represents the absolute floor of American global power projection. Civilians assume this number reflects budget caps or political posturing, but the reality is grounded in the hard limits of nuclear engineering. The paradox of the 11-carrier fleet is simple. To have 3 ships ready for war, you must possess 8 others in reserve. This is the rule of thirds, a logistical nightmare that keeps Pentagon admirals awake, calculating the erosion of global deterrence capability. When the Navy claims 11 carriers, they are essentially stating that only 3 strike groups are actually deployable at any given moment. Today, we dissect the death spiral, a catastrophic systemic failure that triggers the moment the fleet subtracts just a single capital ship. We will penetrate the classified dry docks, where these 100,000-ton monsters are surgically sliced in half for midlife nuclear refueling. The safety of the global maritime economy hangs by a thread, and that thread is spun from the hull of the 11th ship. If you understand the weight of maintaining this fragile global order, acknowledge the logistics in the comments. Now, let us run the calculation. To grasp why 11 is the critical threshold, you must view the aircraft carrier not as a ship, but as a biological organism. These are metabolizing cities, consuming uranium and jet fuel, requiring rest cycles to prevent systemic organ failure and total mechanical collapse. The Navy formalizes this biological rhythm as the Optimized Fleet Response Plan, a 36-month cycle that dictates the life of every sailor. Visualize 3 distinct operational buckets: the deployed, the surge-ready, and the deep maintenance. This is the trinity of naval readiness. Bucket 1 represents the tip of the spear, the 3 carriers currently patrolling the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, or the Taiwan Strait. Ships like the USS Abraham Lincoln are currently operating at maximum tempo, launching sorties to intercept Houthi drones or monitor PLA movements. 6,000 crew members live in a steel box, protecting shipping lanes that transport 20% of the world's crude oil supply. These forward-deployed assets are the primary variable in the geopolitical equation, the only kinetic force standing between free trade and anarchy. Bucket 2 is the pulse check, consisting of 3 to 4 carriers docked in San Diego or Norfolk, appearing ready but legally undeployable. While physically intact, their air wings are decertified, pilots are requalifying, and nuclear reactors are undergoing intermediate-level maintenance and diagnostic checks. In a red storm rising scenario, these ships could surge within 30 days, but for routine deterrence, they are effectively strictly offline. Bucket 3 is the graveyard shift, where 3 or 4 carriers effectively vanish from the strategic map for years at a time. These vessels are stripped down to their skeletons in dry dock, surrounded by scaffolding, void of crew, aircraft, or defensive munitions. They are not warships in this state. They are industrial construction sites located in Newport News, Virginia, or Bremerton, Washington. Do the arithmetic: 3 fighting, 4 training, and 4 broken equals 11 total hulls required to sustain the minimum viable presence. There is zero margin for error. The 11th carrier acts as the sole insurance policy against unforeseen mechanical disasters or combat damage. Remove that 11th hull, and the rotational schedule collapses, forcing deployed ships to remain at sea beyond their human and mechanical limits. Let us examine the consequences of failure. France operates the Charles de Gaulle, a formidable nuclear carrier, but they only possess one. Every 7 years, the Charles de Gaulle enters dry dock for 18 months, leaving France with absolutely zero carrier-based power projection capability. The United Kingdom operates 2 Queen Elizabeth-class carriers, yet recently found itself with zero operational capacity due to a propeller shaft failure. The Royal Navy, once the supreme ruler of the waves, was reduced to a spectator force because they lacked depth in their roster. The United States cannot afford such a gap. Maintaining 3 watchstanders requires a deep bench of 8 backups in the maintenance pipeline. History proves the danger of cheating this math. In 2012, the Navy retired the USS Enterprise before the USS Gerald R. Ford was ready. For 5 years, the fleet operated with 10 carriers, a decision Pentagon planners promised would be manageable through schedule optimization and extensions. They were catastrophically wrong, and the resulting strain nearly broke the backbone of the naval aviation community and the ships themselves. Aircraft carriers operate on a 24-hour cycle, 365 days a year, grinding down steel and sailors with relentless friction. With 11 ships, a standard deployment is 7 months. With 10, that deployment stretches to 9, 10, or even 11 months. Imagine living in a berthing compartment, the size of a walk-in closet, with 60 other people for 300 consecutive days. You sleep in a rack, a coffin-sized bunk stacked 3 high, with 20 inches of clearance and continuous noise from flight ops. During the 10-carrier gap, divorce rates spiked, retention plummeted, and the physical condition of the deployed ships deteriorated rapidly from overuse. This is the death spiral. Longer deployments break the ships, which then require longer maintenance periods, creating larger gaps for the remaining fleet. The repercussions of the 10-carrier schedule extended beyond missed birthdays. It triggered a hemorrhage of institutional knowledge that money cannot replace. Chief Petty Officers, the nuclear-certified backbone of the reactor department, began resigning in numbers that terrified the Bureau of Naval Personnel. These are not replaceable cogs. They are technicians with 15 years of experience managing the volatility of a pressurized water reactor. Fighter pilots, representing a $10 million taxpayer investment per human, engaged their own form of brutal mathematics, the airline option. Commercial carriers like Delta offer a predictable schedule and a Marriott bed, a stark contrast to the coffin lockers of the USS Nimitz. When a lieutenant commander walks away, the Navy loses a decade of tactical intuition that no simulator can replicate or restore. Simultaneously, the physical platforms began to fracture. Steel pushed past its yield point does not recover, it simply cracks. Steam catapults, fired thousands of times beyond their service intervals, suffered catastrophic seal failures, effectively disarming the ship at sea. Electrical grids designed for the 90s shorted out under the load of modern avionics, turning floating cities into drifting husks. When these exhausted leviathans finally limped back to Norfolk, the damage was so structural that maintenance timelines doubled overnight. A scheduled 6-month planned incremental availability metastasized into 10 months of emergency repairs, creating a strategic vacuum in the rotation. In 2015, this math delivered a terrifying result. For weeks, the Persian Gulf was devoid of a United States aircraft carrier. The Mediterranean Sea sat empty, a 60,000 square mile void of American influence, visible to every satellite operated by Moscow and Tehran. Adversaries do not guess. They track our deployment cycles, identifying the gaps created by our maintenance backlog and striking within them. This strategic failure is not an accident. It is the unavoidable output of the Refueling and Complex Overhaul, or RCOH. RCOH is the single most expensive, hazardous, and logistically complex industrial event in the modern military world. The 2 A4W nuclear reactors inside a Nimitz-class carrier are engineering marvels, capable of 25 years of continuous operation. But at the quarter-century mark, the highly enriched uranium is depleted, and the ship essentially becomes a floating radioactive brick. Refueling is not a pit stop. The ship must travel to Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, the only facility on Earth equipped for this task. Once inside Dry Dock 12, engineers drain 100 million gallons of water and begin the unthinkable. They slice the ship open. This is not maintenance, it is an autopsy on a living patient. They cut through 4 inches of flight deck steel to expose the reactor. The vessel, built as a monolithic unibody structure to survive torpedo impacts, is surgically violated to access the containment vessels deep within. For 48 months, this $13 billion asset is rendered completely inert, a helpless pile of scaffolding and exposed wiring. During this window, the USS John C. Stennis is not a warship. It is a fixed structure in Virginia, utterly irrelevant to the Pacific Theater. Workers replace almost every system: radar arrays, catapult troughs, desalination plants, and miles of fiber optic cabling are ripped out. You cannot accelerate this process. Nuclear physics does not negotiate with congressional schedules or urgent operational requirements. Rush a weld on a reactor coolant pipe, and you do not get a delay, you get a radiological incident near a major population center. The workforce required is a distinct breed. These are nuclear-grade welders and physicists, a labor pool that takes a decade to cultivate. You cannot simply hire 1,000 extra contractors to speed up the timeline. They lack the security clearance and the hyper-specialized certification. Therefore, the math remains rigid. Every carrier spends 15% of its 50-year lifespan completely incapacitated in dry dock. If you possess 11 carriers and one is always trapped in the RCOH cycle, your functional operational ceiling is immediately reduced to 10. And as we established in the previous analysis, a 10-ship fleet is a recipe for the systemic collapse of the deployment rotation. The logical counter-argument is volume. Why not build 12, 13, or 14 carriers to create a functional buffer zone? The answer exposes the terrifying fragility of the American industrial base. We have forgotten how to build at scale. During the Cold War, multiple shipyards competed for contracts. Today, Huntington Ingalls Industries is the sole survivor of that industrial extinction. One single location, a few square miles in Virginia, represents the entire aircraft carrier production capacity of the United States. If a Category 5 hurricane strikes the Virginia coast, or a cyber attack cripples the shipyard's crane infrastructure, production halts globally. This single point of failure is already operating at maximum theoretical capacity, struggling to deliver ships on existing timelines. The USS John F. Kennedy was floated in 2019, yet years of outfitting remain before it can theoretically launch a combat sortie. Even with a blank check from Congress today, a hypothetical 12th carrier would not join the fleet until the late 2030s. By that date, the USS Nimitz and USS Dwight D. Eisenhower will have aged out, requiring retirement and keeping the total number static. We are not building ships fast enough to expand the fleet. We are sprinting just to maintain the status quo of 11. Then there is the fiscal cliff. A Ford-class carrier commands a $13 billion price tag, but the ship is merely the container. A carrier never sails alone. It requires a strike group of guided missile destroyers, attack submarines, and fast combat support ships. Add the air wing, 4 squadrons of F-35Cs and Super Hornets, plus E-2D Hawkeyes, costing billions more in procurement and sustainment. Fielding a single additional carrier strike group requires an upfront capital investment exceeding $50 billion, equivalent to the GDP of Tunisia. In a political environment defined by debt ceilings and inflation, 11 is not just a target, it is the absolute fiscal ceiling. The number 11 is codified in federal law, not because it is optimal, but because it is the only number the system can sustain. This limitation brings us to the two-war standard, the nightmare scenario that keeps the Joint Chiefs of Staff analyzing logistics tables. The U.S. military doctrine mandates the ability to fight one major theater war while simultaneously holding the line in a second conflict. Execute the simulation. The People's Liberation Army initiates an amphibious assault on Taiwan, effectively closing the semiconductor supply chain. The Pacific Command Response Protocol dictates a surge of 4 carrier strike groups to establish a denial zone east of the island. Recognizing the American distraction, Iranian proxies simultaneously mine the Strait of Hormuz, choking off 30% of the world's seaborne oil. To reopen this artery and prevent a global economic depression, Central Command requires a minimum of 2 carriers on station immediately. Now, apply the brutal arithmetic of the 11-ship fleet to this dual-theater nightmare scenario. Total inventory is 11. Subtract the 4 hulls locked in deep maintenance and RCOH, leaving 7 deployable assets. Deploy 4 to the Taiwan Strait and 2 to the Persian Gulf. The remainder is exactly 1 aircraft carrier. 1 single floating airfield remains to cover the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Arctic, and the homeland defense of the United States. If the fleet inventory drops to 10, that single reserve unit evaporates, leaving the commander-in-chief with 0 strategic flexibility. At 10 ships, the president faces a binary choice: abandon the silicon supply chain in the Pacific, or surrender the energy grid in the Middle East. You cannot execute both missions. The physics of transit times and deck cycles makes it impossible to be in two places at once. This is not hypothetical game theory. The utility of the 11th carrier was proven in the Red Sea during the autumn of 2023. When Houthi anti-ship ballistic missiles began targeting commercial container traffic, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower was already on station. It did not require a 3-week transit from San Diego. It was present, armed, and fueled because the rotation schedule allowed it. Within hours, F/A-18 Super Hornets were catapulting from the deck, intercepting kinetic threats and enforcing freedom of navigation. That immediate response capability is the dividend paid by the 11th ship. It buys time when the world catches fire. Yet, we cannot discuss the steel without acknowledging the biological engine that keeps it moving, the crew. The logistical scale of human sustainment on a Nimitz-class carrier rivals that of a small municipality, but with far higher stakes. Every 24 hours, the supply department prepares, cooks, and serves over 17,000 individual meals while rolling in heavy seas. They bake bread, process thousands of pounds of laundry, and manage a waste treatment system for 5,000 people in a combat zone. These sailors sleep in stacks 3 high, separated by aluminum pans, directly beneath a flight deck that mimics the acoustics of a continuous car crash. A steam catapult slamming into the water break generates a mechanical violence that shakes the dust off the overhead piping in the berthing areas. The newest USS Gerald R. Ford class attempts to mitigate this with gender-neutral infrastructure and improved climate control, but it remains a warship. When a recruit signs the contract, they are volunteering to pause their existence, missing births, deaths, and the passage of time on land. They exist in a monochrome world of gray steel and non-skid paint, so that global commerce can navigate a world of color. The number 11 is a compromise between the laws of thermodynamics, industrial capacity, and the limits of human endurance. 11 carriers allow for 7-month deployments, a duration that is psychologically grueling but historically survivable for the volunteer force. Reduce the fleet to 10, and you break the human component, burn out the crew, and the $13 billion reactor becomes a tomb. America needs 11 carriers because that is the mathematical floor for maintaining a global order that favors free trade. It allows for 3 ships watching our rivals, 3 ships training to surge, and 5 ships undergoing the surgery required to reach age 50. It is not 10, because the 2012 gap proved that 10 breaks the fleet. It is not 12, because our shipyards have forgotten how to build them. 11 is the hard deck. It is the absolute minimum requirement to sustain the illusion of omnipresence. The next time you observe a carrier on the news, do not see a boat. Recognize it as one of only 3 ready assets on the planet. Remember the 19-year-old on the dark flight deck, holding the weight of a $70 million decision in his hands. Realize that the margin between stability and chaos is exactly as thin as the hull plating of that single ship. That is why the number 11 matters. It is the structural beam holding up the ceiling of the global security architecture. If this analysis clarified the hidden mechanics of naval power, signal your understanding by engaging with the like button. It supports our mission to decode the industrial and human reality behind the headlines. Until the next briefing, remain vigilant. End of transmission.